welcome to the Photos and Art session of the Design Apprenticeship. So we just did the basics of newspaper design session, and so now we're kind of move into a closer look on those photos and art. And as we talked about last session, these are arguably one of the most important things that are going into your publication, because usually the art that you put on the page is going to be the first thing that catches your reader's eye and pulls them in. So it's important that not only are we picking strong pieces of art to run in the publications, but that we're also playing to the strengths of that art. So we'll be looking at a couple of different things throughout this presentation, and then this will also serve as a nice segue into our next session, which is going to be magazines. So as I was saying before, it's really important to make sure that you're picking strong visuals for the front page, for the cover of your magazine, for your big feature articles, because visuals are what sells our media. It's going to be usually the first thing that you see while walking by a newsstand, or when you're just walking by and deciding what magazine to pick up off the shelf. If we are choosing lackluster or unimportant imagery, you're going to be losing potential readers right off the jump. So one of the most important things that we can use in our photos, of course, are going to be photos of people. Very rarely is a photo of a building or another inanimate object going to be something that catches your reader's eye. And the reason that is because humans connect with other humans. And so if we're seeing that emotion on the page, or seeing somebody even that we know, it's going to be more likely that we are going to want to pick up that publication or want to tune in to see what exactly this article is about. When helping editors choose art, so again, this is kind of a collaborative effort between the visual arts editor, the designer, and then of course the section editor. So some things that you all should be looking for are a clean and clear subject. So a good photo, like a well-written story, is easy to read. It presents information that's free of clutter and distractions. And every photo needs to be sharply focused and cleanly composed, so its most important elements stand out instantly. One of the biggest things that you can keep in mind, and this also kind of goes along with the last point of prioritizing relevance, is that the best photo that you can choose for the story is going to be one that stands on its own. So what I mean by that is that even if I decide not to read the article, which we hope that people will, but at the end of the day, that photo should almost give me enough information as a viewer to kind of understand what this story is going to be about. Those are going to be the best storytelling tools that you have, because again, you know that you're choosing a strong photo then, and of course, if the reader is getting majority of the story, and it's telling them a bit of what they need to know, again, there's going to be that kind of lure that pulls them into the rest of the article. The next thing to keep in mind is going to be that candid shots are best. Now, of course, if you've got that photo of somebody holding a big giant check or award that they won and they're staring directly at the camera, it doesn't mean that you can't use that image within the article, whether that be in print or online as an additional secondary image. But when we're looking to decide what to run as the dominant image, we definitely don't want to see, when possible, people smiling stiffly at the camera. We really want to see them engaged naturally in activity, whatever that may be. I know that sometimes with photographers, and I remind them of this, people are inclined, once they know a photographer's in the room, to start looking at the photographer and trying to pose and smile, and that's not what we want. Whenever possible, we want to use the photos of real people doing real things, not people gazing blankly into a space, or even in the cases where we know that somebody is pretending to be busy. So somebody sitting at their desk and shuffling papers isn't really a strong image. And so going back to my note before about somebody, winning a check or a big award or things like that, thinking about, why that person is winning the award. So is this person winning the award because they got the most volunteer hours out of a, campus department out of the whole year? Okay, if that's the case, then the dominant image should probably be them doing the volunteer work. So if their thing was walking dogs, have a photo of them walking dogs as the big dominant image, because again, that's going to catch people's attention. And then that secondary photo can ultimately help to kind of tell the entire story, but in a smaller role, where they are holding that award and smiling at the camera. And then just going back to that prioritizing relevance, readers do not have time for trivia and text, and they don't want it in photos either. Do not make them guess how this photo is related to the article. It can become very obvious when designers and editors are using photos to fill space. Of course, sometimes we have great photos that can fill space, and that works out. But the image has to have a direct connection to the news. It's got to provide information, not just serve as decoration. And like we talked about last week, of course, we've got that hand rule where if you put your hand on the page and it doesn't touch any art, then you need to find something to put in there. But even in those cases, when we talked about not overusing design aids and things like that, that goes for photos too. So one example that I like to use is that we ran an article a few years ago about professors doing research, and I can't remember, it was about like enrollment and the kind of students that were coming to campus, not coming to campus, things like that. But instead of trying to think outside the box or get an image that was relevant to the contents of the research, the students just used a picture of the cupola on campus. And while of course the cupola is a, notable image and beacon on campus, and it does represent ECU in a way, it is a hop, skip, and a jump to try and figure out how that is necessarily relevant to the contents of the article. So again, that's what I go back to. The strongest images that you choose are going to be ones that kind of go ahead and give some information on what that article is about, not just breaking up type and saying, oh, well, we're going to use the cupola because it's an article about ECU and the cupola is a part of ECU. Again, that's a jump, and we don't want to make our readers also have to make that jump with us and make it blatantly obvious that we were trying to fill some space up. So I've got a couple of images that are coming up, and I know that you are watching this virtually, and so normally we would go through the conversation of what makes these images good photos, but we are going to go ahead and look at those together on this video and just think about the different ways of what a good photo is, because good doesn't always mean like heartwarming. Good really in the sense of, is it doing its job as a storytelling tool? So this one, again, kind of going right off the jump, good photos aren't always heartwarming photos. Now, of course, it is heartwarming because you're picking up on some deep details here where you're seeing that there are people through the hands. You can tell that there are several people coming to this little boy's aid. We don't know exactly why yet, but we do know that there's something going on, and it evidently is something urgent because I think I can pinpoint at least 3 people in this photo that are coming to care for this child. And so in and of itself, even without knowing the story of this image completely, I have been able to take these details and kind of deduce to you what is most likely going on. And again, we don't exactly know all of the nitty-gritty of the story behind this photo, but we know enough to lead us into the story and say, okay, well, this has pulled me in. I really want to know, how is this child doing? What is going on? Where is this located? So again, that's what I'm talking about with a good photo is not always necessarily heartwarming. So again, it is heartwarming to see the amount of people who have come to help, but of course is, gut-wrenching to see a child in this condition and seeing that look of, distance and almost, despair in their eyes is very sad. With that, again, we are looking for the storytelling aspect when picking photos. This photo, just to switch up the mood just a little bit, normally when I ask students, what's happening in this photo, it's very evident that this is a winning moment for this team. And with that, we can tell because of the emotion from this player right here. They're looking very excited. Clearly over here, it was probably almost a shocking, maybe close win or unexpected win. And so we're getting all of these details from the story. And I say it all the time, I'm not really a sports person. I wish I could give you the full background on this photo. I did have a student a few years ago who remembers this game specifically and how close it was. But this was many, many years ago, and I also, again, not a sports person. But on that note, sometimes the good photo that you would use as the dominant image for your story isn't necessarily going to be the expected photo. So a lot of times with sports articles and things like that, the expected photo is that you're going to have some kind of picture of the players on the field, or, you know, whatever arena they may be in. But again, people in images sell stories, not necessarily, you know, people in helmets, because we're kind of usually losing that emotional aspect. So again, looking for opportunities to find emotion even in those instances where it may not always be as evident, because again, while those photos of the football players on the field are super cool and you get them like jumping and, you know, that good stop action, sometimes these are going to be the better photos to use that encompass the overall motion of a game, especially if we're doing post coverage. And that's also the same for losing games, especially if you've got a coach whose career is riding on the end product of a game. And, you know, always look to the coach. We've had ones before where they've got like clipboards over their head that they look like they're about to break, because they're like, oh my gosh, we just lost that game. So those are also going to be the emotions that we want to capture, because again, what's going on in people's minds and their faces sometimes can be much stronger than just those action images of players on the field. All right, switching back into a much sadder vibe and situation, we have this picture here that is, again, absolutely gut-wrenching. We have, you know, can pick up from this image that there was a fire. Clearly, they've lost their whole house, if not just the majority of it, and you can see that they are absolutely devastated in this moment, and a firefighter is coming to comfort them. And so we've pulled that much from the photo without having any backstory on this. Now, a lot of times I get the question from students, and this does delve into the ethics aspect of newsrooms and whether or not to run photos. Some students will look at this photo and say, I don't know why they would run that on the front page. This is clearly such a personal and devastating moment for this family. And you're absolutely right. It is completely devastating and gut-wrenching, and it just breaks your heart, even before you know the full details. But sometimes papers do choose to run these tragic images in moments like this. And there's a whole slew of questions that you go through. Are you acting with compassion? Are you at the least intrusive distance possible? Would publishing this lead to further trauma and things like that? And so these are all questions that not only photographers but newsroom editors have to ask themselves when we're trying to decide, should we use this photo, and if so, why? What is the reasoning behind it? And so in the case of this image in particular, there was a bit of debate in that newsroom about whether or not to use it. The news editor was adamant about not using it, whereas the photographer really made a case to use the photo, and it did end up running, because the additional backstory that you don't quite get from this photo is that she found out that her son was lost in this fire. But not only was her son lost in the fire, but when you kind of get to the reasoning of it, they found out that the family had recently moved into the home, and that the fire alarms were not up to date, and so, or the smoke detectors rather. And so unfortunately that led to this really heartbreaking situation. And so with that, the photographers, you know, kind of point to the editor was that this could happen to anybody. And are we using this moment because, you know, it's traumatic and it's going to get people's attention and that's what we want? Or are we using this photo because we're trying, you know, with this tragedy to help show readers and almost teach readers that this could happen to anybody? Like you really do need to check your fire alarms and smoke detectors and things like that in your home. And that was kind of the ultimate, I guess, winning argument on it, and why it went on to go to print, and of course won many awards, but that's not the important part. But again, just going into what makes a good photo doesn't always mean it's going to make you feel warm and fuzzy inside. Sometimes a good photo not only, of course, tells the story, but has potential to relay to readers a message as well in tandem with the contents of the article. And again, every newsroom is going to have a different set of how they approach ethics and standards and things like that. So I can't sit here and tell you that just because this one newsroom ran this photo, that doesn't mean that another newsroom would be like, no, absolutely not. Like, just a picture of the house and the damage is enough to tell that story. But again, these are conversations that may happen in the newsroom, and you need to be prepared to think about how we might approach it and when we're just, you know, sensationalizing something versus when we are actually trying to be avid journalists telling a bigger story than just what's exactly in the photo. All right, switching back on a lighter note for the last picture of this session, we've got this picture of a little girl in a watermelon, I'm going to say basket. It is too big to be a basket. But this is event, if you can kind of guess from it. So we've got the little girl and the watermelons. But if you're looking around, you can tell that this is some kind of outdoor event. We've got tents, people have bags. So we assume that they've been shopping. I can pull all this information again just by looking at it. And so again, seeing the produce here, and I know this is kind of grainy on screen, but also more produce boxes in the back. I'm going to go ahead and guess that this is probably a farmer's market. And so what makes this a good image is that a lot of times with farmers markets, local events that happen all the time, what you're going to find as a designer, especially if you're around here for a couple of years, is that a lot of times when we have these reoccurring events that you design or we cover year after year after year, you're going to get a lot of similar photos. And it's okay to have those base assignment photos. Of course, a photographer is going to go to the event and get pictures of vendors interacting with customers and people walking around at the event. But with things like this, especially with the reoccurring ones, and really any assignment in particular, if we can find a new perspective of the event or a new way to present it that is unusual or something that your readers may not always see, or even if they went to the farmer's market, maybe this isn't even something that they had a chance to witness, then this can also make for a good eye-catching image because, again, it's kind of breaking up the monotony of something that we usually see and introducing something cute or unique or different. And again, that in and of itself is still eye-catching enough to make a good page and be a better option for one of your dominant art photos. Because again, at the end of the day, we've got this cute shot here, but I can still pull all of the information that I need to know that this was at a farmer's market. So this article is related to the farmer's market. Now I can go through the article reading and knowing that. So sometimes as a designer, you've got a couple of options if the art that comes in just isn't good. And so again, using good in that framework of like not necessarily heartwarming or making you happy, but good storytelling imagery. And so sometimes that could mean that the images were blurry or they're just not as relevant as they should have been. Just like you guys are new designers and you'll have a learning curve. Sometimes we have newer photographers come in, and of course, you all are hired because you're skilled and talented, but not everybody has a great day. We're all going to turn in an assignment one day that just doesn't quite hit the mark. And so photographers aren't exempt from that either. And so sometimes the newsroom might get an assignment that's just not quite up to snuff. And so there's a couple things you can do to help save the day as a designer if that's the case. Also, editors have the opportunity to ask for a couple of things. On your end, look to edit carefully. So are you looking to see, is there one successful image that shows more than the rest? Is there somebody with a particularly emotional face, gesture, or action? Your goal is to find the most informative picture out of the bunch. It may not be the best picture, but which one is giving you the most information possible and seeing how you can work with that. The next thing you can do is crop aggressively. So as a designer, of course, you know that you are going to let the photo tell you how it needs to be designed. But of course, we can look for ways to, again, help with that goal of defining a clean and clear subject. So if there's a lot of junk in the photo and things that are distracting from the actual subject that we want to focus on, make sure that you're cutting out the fat of the photo and play up what's important. So that happens by eliminating the rest. So if we've got the dead space off to the side or we've got somebody's elbow sticking out in the corner, we want to make sure and go ahead and get rid of those so the attention isn't being taken away from what we want the readers to see in the photo. Additionally, kind of same deal, if somebody's like thumb got in a picture, obviously get rid of the thumb so we're not focusing on the giant thumb that showed up in the frame. You can also run the photo in a sequence. So I talk a lot about dominant art and then playing up other images as like secondary role, but sometimes two small photos aren't as bad as one big weak one. So if all the photos just aren't quite hitting the mark, but let's say you've got 2 or 3 photos that if you ran them together kind of helps to tell the story, you can run them in a smaller form, either side by side, or, top to bottom and things like that, because this will also be a way to get your art in, tell your story, but not necessarily blow up a photo just for the sake of blowing one up to fill space on a page or because you think you need one dominant image. Again, sometimes you can create a dominant module of images by running that sequence. As a last-ditch effort, sometimes it's possible to consider a reshoot. So with that, it's just asking, is there time? Is there a willing photographer or an available subject? Sometimes there's not time. If a photographer went to an event and the photos just did not turn out good, there just usually isn't an opportunity to redo that. It is a missed moment, and we're going to have to either work with what we've got or, worst case scenario, consider it a wash and see if we can get contributed photos. But sometimes on a production night, there could be instances like a shot of a building that's being constructed on campus. That's still going to be there. There may or may not, depending on what time it is, still be construction workers out there. So it is possible that the visual arts editor might be able to send another photographer out or even go and retake the photos if they have the time to do so. So sometimes that is an option. Not always an option, but it's one that can be asked for. Lastly, you can use alternative art. So thinking, is there another way to illustrate this story other than just using photography? So can I use a chart or a map, or can I use a headshot and a pull quote to combine to have something really powerful stand out in the story? Is there a sidebar that can be created? These are all questions that you can look at with your editor, and particularly in a pinch. Of course, in an ideal world, maps and charts and things like that should be planned in advance. But in a pinch, this is also the part where I'm really encouraging y'all to make sure you're reading your content as well before you're laying it out on a page, because if you've hit this wall where you and the editor are like, no, these photos just aren't going to work, what else can we do? You can help brainstorm with them by reading that article and seeing if there's any information you can pull out to create even a simple graphic. You don't have to do this elaborate graphic package or anything like that, especially not on a production night. But all of these things can help. So definitely read your text and kind of figure out, is there any alternative art that we can use here or that I can create by simply pulling text and either putting it on a breakout box, which could just be, if you're on a black and white page, a little gray screened out box, or of course, if you're on a color page, you can absolutely do something a little bit more elaborate depending on the time that you have. This is just an example here of how to crop aggressively. Not that this is a bad image over here on the left, but you can see, like I said, we've got an arm here that doesn't need to be here, and then a bright yellow balloon that we want to get rid of because the yellow is absolutely pulling my attention in more than the speaker is. But you can see over here on the right that by cropping aggressively, we are able to bring that attention back into the subject. If you wanted to crop even more, you could probably get this head out of the shot at the bottom too. But we left it in there because, it is nice to show that there were people in the crowd, even if we can't see those people's faces. This is just one way to show that, of course, she was speaking to people. And now, granted, even if we were to crop that head out, we still know she's probably not talking to herself. But this is, by leaving this in, it's just another way of continuing to tell a little bit more about the story behind this photo. Other things that you can do if the art isn't good, so you can bury it. So sometimes you've got a lead story of the day, but the art that goes with it just, again, wasn't up to par. And so that means that maybe it's not the article on the page that you play up with the dominant art and things like that. But as long as it's still at the top of the page, maybe in a right-handed rail or a right-handed one-column article at the top of the page with the bold headline, you're still doing it justice as lead news, or even bannering it across the top of the section, again, with a bold headline so it can really stand out. And then if the article has to jump or things like that, you can bury the photo that comes with it, so perhaps running it with a jump on page 2 or wherever the article ended up. So that way it still has art, but we're not glorifying big art that just doesn't really do too much. The other thing you can do is do a mortise over a photo, of one photo over another. And so this technique can be risky, but it might help if there's an offensive element you need to eliminate or disguise. And by offensive element, I just mean maybe you did have a thumb in the photo or something, but it's not in a position where it can be cropped. But maybe there's a way we can add another image that helps to continue to tell the story. In this case over here on the right, I've included an example of a mortise. It's not that there was anything offensive in this image particularly, but beneath the student's feet, it was just a bunch of negative space that wasn't really being used, wasn't telling the story. So they felt on staff at that time that it would be better to use that space to incorporate another photo that helps tell the rest of the story. So we can see the student walking in the heavy rain here, and then we can see, you can't tell as well on the screen, but the aftermath where trees and debris had hit this car's windshield and damaged it. So again, sometimes it can be used to help tell a little bit more of the story. And then lastly, remind yourself that bad art is worse than no art at all. When in doubt, you can just fall back on headshots if available as a means of breaking the type up. Some of the most common bad photos, and again, I put bad in quotes because they're not bad. They're just kind of PR-y, or you can tell that they're set up, or just, at worst, boring. And that's what we mean by bad. It's not to poo-poo the people in the picture or their achievements or whatever may be going on. But again, like I mentioned at the beginning of the slides, one of the most common ones is somebody being presented an award. And again, this is boring just because they're not really doing anything other than looking at the camera. So it's kind of a stagnant image. Similarly, they've got an award here, but this is kind of the one where you have a bunch of people line up against a wall and smile for the camera. So this could be group activities or things like that. Again, not that eye-catching or entertaining. Again, very awesome and great for these people's achievements, and I'm sure that their loved ones are very excited to see them in the paper. But as I mentioned before, we would love to see why these people are winning these awards. So getting photos of them doing whatever it is that they did to earn these awards in these pictures. And then still, like I said before, it doesn't mean that these photos are useless or shouldn't be used, but should probably be used in a smaller capacity, again, as an embedded photo rather than the dominant one. Down here, we've got the board meeting. Board meetings, again, usually not particularly exciting. Every so often, you might get, a council member that gets really spicy and you get an emotional photo. So, of course, it's worth looking at the agenda to see kind of what's coming up and if there's any controversial topics that might get people worked up. But beyond that, these images don't really catch anybody's attention because, again, yes, a board meeting happened, but we all know what happens in board meetings, and board go hand in hand. So, again, a fine secondary image, but what's on the agenda? What are we talking about? Are we talking about construction on Dickinson Avenue? Is that the main thing on the docket today? Then we want the dominant photo to be a picture of the construction on Dickinson Avenue. And then we go back to this as a secondary image. And then, of course, we have the image of the guy at his desk. This is often a fallback on campus because you've got these professors who are doing cool academic things, and then one of the default pictures is getting a picture of them at their desk, because sometimes we don't necessarily know how to approach the research or what have you. But again, looking at, what is this professor doing or this faculty member that's so interesting, staff members, things like that, and trying to figure out how can we incorporate that into the photo assignment, or picking photos that represent that over prioritizing photos that look like this. So again, on the design aspect, you're probably going to receive a lot of photos to sift through. And sometimes students will choose the photo that actually didn't tell the story as best, because designing wise, maybe it was easier to run this horizontal photo and call it a day, when really you had a vertical photo of him. Who knows? I don't know. Maybe he's like a 5K runner or something. I don't know. I'm making up a story. But there was a great vertical shot of him running the 5K, but you just didn't feel like doing a vertical shot that day. That's not good. We do really want to prioritize those good images if we have them. So as a designer, you need to be on the lookout for those. You want the candids, the action, and of course the images with people in it and doing those things. As a designer, you also have the ability to crop, like I mentioned before, and there's often multiple ways you can crop a photo. to save space. Of course, this photo could run as is. It's pretty cool. You can see how high he's jumping up off the ground. You get that emotion. But of course, in print, sometimes we're looking at ways to conserve space because we don't always have the room and the pages to run art as big as we'd like. So just make sure you're paying attention to how to naturally crop. In this case, we've got still seeing where there's some air beneath him, so we can tell he jumped relatively high. Maybe not as much information as we get in this photo, but still a cool shot nonetheless. And additionally, in a really tight spot, or if you're looking for a way to switch up your standard headshot, sometimes cropping closer to get this real dramatic effect on those facial expressions is a good option as well. So oftentimes there can be more than one way you can crop a photo, but just make sure that you're paying attention to that to get the desired effect, and also make the best use of your space. With the good crops, again, eliminate what's unnecessary, so sky, floor, and distractions. We want a little bit of breathing room, but other than that, you don't need too much. Of course, you can utilize the rule of thirds. So down on the third bullet point, it says leave breathing room where needed. So giving active or directional photos a loose crop so action isn't jamming into the edge of the frame. So if somebody's riding a bike, we don't need a whole bunch behind them and the bike, but I do want to see what is ahead of them as they are riding the bike. We don't want to cut off that motion. And additionally, cropping adds impact when it's done well. So your goal is to find the focal point of a photo and enhance it, and pretty much crop photos until they yell at your readers. If it's not standing out, sometimes it's worth investigating a photo and just looking a little bit more closely and seeing like, oh wow, like there was a crowd shot of the baseball team celebrating a win, but if we get a bit closer, we can see that there was one player in particular that was more emotional, and maybe you crop tighter on that player in general. Bad crops, we're going to be amputating body parts and lopping off appendages, so missing arms and legs, baseball hats, instruments getting cut off, all kinds of things like that we want to avoid. And most often this happens because a designer is trying to force a photo into a spot where it does not belong, and that is because sometimes designers will try and set up a horizontal oriented page before the art has come in or before they've had a chance to see it. And they don't want to switch it up when they realize that the best image is a vertical, so they'll try and put a vertical in a horizontal spot, and that just doesn't work. Again, let the photo tell you how it needs to be designed. And then lastly, we don't want to change the meaning of a photo by removing information if we crop too much. So if you've got a picture of an excited dog, that's cute and that works out. But we don't want to cut out the information that tells us why the dog is excited. So in that case, if the owner was throwing a ball at them and we cropped out the owner and the ball, and then we're just seeing the dog smiling, we are missing a piece of that photo, even if it still looks cute to us. We definitely don't want to crop out important information just for space saving purposes. Again, look at the art first and figure out how it needs to be designed on the page. Lastly, for magazines in particular, you don't want to violate works of art. These should always be printed in full. If you are cropping a submitted piece of art from a student for either Rebel or Expressions, and you do decide to crop it, you need to label that shot as a detail, and then elsewhere in the publication, usually right next to it, you're going to have the art as is in a normal cropping with no edits or anything on our behalf. So just make sure that we are letting submitted art stand as is in these publications. This is just an example of cropping to help the photo yell. So we've got this snake on a branch over here and this little hand in the background. And this is not a bad photo. This is a really good photo even as is, but the hand can kind of serve as a distraction that takes us away from the snake. But you can see that because of the tight cropping that was implemented on it, we get a much more dynamic and interesting image. So on that note, as a designer, don't write off images right away when you see them. Do look into cropping to see if there's any way to strengthen that image, because a lot of times there can be a little bit of a deeper story or impact within the image. It just takes a little bit of looking on your end. And again, I was talking about the baseball player earlier, and so this is an example of, yes, we could use this crowd shot here, but we've got some distractions with the audience in the back and the chopped off heads and bodies. So it does take some of my attention away. But if we crop a little bit tighter, we can get more of that emotion from the baseball team. And so that's really what we're looking for in Office. And this is certainly the kind of cropping that a designer can implement. Looking at some unethical cropping, and again, going back to don't take out information from the photo that would help to otherwise maybe explain the full story. We've got the middle image here, which is the original. So we've got a, I believe, prisoner of war, and we've got them giving him water over here on the right, but also simultaneously holding a gun to his head. So if we were to crop it without the water aspect, this is kind of giving off a little bit more of a merciless, vicious vibe. Now, of course, to hold a gun to anybody's head is vicious. But then, of course, you go over here to the right, and they're giving him water. It looks very compassionate. And in reality, this actual image that we're seeing here, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. So we do get that mix of compassion, but then it's a completely different image where we're kind of, again, without totally knowing the details of it, yes, you can show compassion, but also understand that possibly this is a dangerous person that they have kept an eye on for whatever reason, or detaining for whatever reason. Again, but by unethically cropping, you're telling two different stories here and not allowing readers to kind of deduce their own thoughts on what's exactly going on in this image here. Because again, the left and the right showed two different vibes completely. We're going to slide into illustrations and graphics really quick. So flavor illustrations, these can be great for focusing on abstract concepts, so things like drugs, diets, and depression. Many of those concepts are either too vague or elusive to photograph, and that's where illustrations can help save the day. These can be silly or serious depending on the topic, but the trick is to avoid overloading your pages with cartoons. Illustrations should serve a purpose. We don't necessarily want it to feel like we went and pulled all the clip art in the world to try and fill space. As you can see here, all of these serve a purpose on the page. So we've got this shark, very cool, but it is going along with Shark Week and safety and things like that. We've got a great little graphic package here, which of course takes more time than just one production night. Something like this would take planning, but all of these little illustrations incorporated here are paired with information for the reader or paired with the story as a whole as the dominant art. Over here, we do have dominant art that again goes to show kind of a more elusive topic. So we're talking about cancer treatments and things like that. Of course, you know, some of the images that could be gotten photography-wise would include somebody receiving chemo, or perhaps somebody, you know, looking at a test tube to explore solutions or cures for cancer and preventions and things like that. But sometimes it's going to be better to have that interesting illustration to help service the dominant art. Again, something like this is going to take planning. This is generally not going to happen overnight. So these conversations need to be happening in advance if an editor wants a flavor illustration to represent a story. Over here, we just got something a little fun for the holidays, but also paired with an actual article. So you can see they did a cute little owl on the Happy Halloween of this paper's flag. And so that's a little bit more decorative than we do normally do, but of course we see things like that for holidays, and that's fine. But down here we can see Psychology of Scare. They did a little Frankenstein illustration as the dominant art for this article in particular. So it is great to pair the illustrations with articles that do make sense, especially when we don't want to resort to more basic images. So Scare, you could get a picture of somebody in a Halloween mask or something like that, but not nearly as eye-catching as perhaps a far less used illustration tactic, especially in newsrooms. These are just some examples of magazine flavor illustrations as we continue to move closer to our magazine session. And just knowing that they can be big and help break up type, again, for those more elusive topics. So this one, of course, is talking about people being addicted to their digital products and that we need a detox. Of course, you could get a picture of somebody on their phone, but this is able to a little bit better show how inundated we are with media with the different icons floating around this character that was created by the illustrator. And then of course dreams, you could get a picture of somebody asleep in their bed, even posed of course, but that's kind of boring and it's not going to speak to me about the dreams that are going on in their head. And so again, looking at those elusive topics and how we can use illustrations to encompass or represent those. I've been taking little jabs at clip art. It can be great, and illustrations in general can be great for filling space, but don't make it so obvious to reader as with any design aid. Readers want information, not decoration, so do not overload your pages. If you are creating essentially clip art, I'm going to be honest, if you're making little illustrations to go with something, do try to give it a purpose instead of just running, hearts around a section for Valentine's Day. Maybe incorporate the hearts into a Valentine's Day theme graphic or sidebar that includes upcoming holiday events related to Valentine's Day. Let your illustrations work in tandem with the information, not separate from it. Because then, again, it's an instance where it becomes a little bit clear that you were just trying to fill space versus trying to offer your reader just a little bit more information, even if it's just pulling out information that's already in the article. We've talked about how people love blurbs and bullets and don't always have time to read a full article. So that's a great opportunity for you as a designer to really provide a service. Just to wrap up this presentation, I will also include a little packet of resources for sidebars and infographics. When people think about infographics, they often are thinking about something bigger like this space race imagery, and of course you certainly can create a graphic package like that. But there are a lot of simple sidebars and infographics that you could probably create pretty easily on a production night when in doubt, when you need some kind of way to freshen things up or you don't have the images you're hoping to receive. So I do include that packet so you can kind of see that it does not always have to be complex and difficult. It can be very simple and still serve a purpose to your reader. And of course, the book that I teach from is very helpful, but it is from the 90s. So the examples in there are a little dated, but that's the fun of being a designer. You can look at something simple like that from the 90s and be like, okay, I could do a pretty simple Q&A layout, but now I can have the time to go in and zhuzh it up how I want, especially if you've got color on the page or something like that, or like I said, a little illustration you've already created that you want to pair with it. So definitely check out those notes as the secondary portion of this presentation, and let me know if you have any questions.